started on her way to her room in the bungalow apartments. Through the many one-level corridors to house number 46, she knew something terrible lurked around the corner, as it always did. She'd heard about the vermin from the old earth, rats and pigeons, this being what she imagined to be the alien version, like everything else on this dust ball. Bigger, creepier, and more dangerous. She'd never had any trouble herself, but her girlfriend had, and a few others in the complex. They seemed to enjoy picking on Lupita more than most, though. As Arabeth came to the turning to the corridor stretch Lupita's room resided on, her steps became slow and laboured. A nihilistic feeling sank into her stomach. Was the potentially fatal trip from her nicer apartments in the warm, sandy, more pleasant area of the settlement to the wasteland tumbleweed despot she found herself really worth it? Just because Lupita doesn't want to be anything but a hermit under a rock? Love is a very weird, potent chemical reaction humans are susceptible to. It makes you do crazy things. They put your heart rate through the roof as you creep into the lion's den, for example. The dank air forced Arabeth to stifle her breath, sounding like a fearful dormouse as her vision bled around the corner. Ever tried to breathe quietly, as not to draw attention to yourself? But the more you try, the louder it seems to get. Like when you don't want people to know you're crying. As with every apartment, the entrance lay in the middle of the corridor, the only door along the bland cream walls. As she stood, with her body half and half on the crease of the wall, her eyes ran along the carpet, red and frayed with the ghost of a pattern that was intended to be niche. Her eyes continued past her girlfriend's front door, and a sizable dark stain crept along the floor hugging the wall. Her mind didn't rest on what it was or could be. There they were. At the length of the corridor, at the intersection to the next, three of them stood. Their appearance was, yes, frightening, but their tendency to stand motionless is what put them into the nightmares of all who crossed them. Dreams of a normal day plagued by their emotionless, bland faces. Stumpy legs, arms that dragged on the ground, necks that were uncomfortably and unnaturally long, bald, hairless heads and hollow caverns where eyes should have sat. Milk bottle complexion, wet, oily skin, and the low, constant, unwavering groan made the Xanitey the most unpleasant thing humanity had come across in all its years of development and evolution. Sand in her shoes, the nightmares at the end of the hall, and the feeling of when you were about to jump. Arabeth didn't want to move the small distance it would take to the relative safety of Lupita's room. Words began to fill her head. It became insufferable, self-deprecating, self-hatred. No one loves you. Life is meaningless. Die, fat, ugly, unimportant, worthless. She knew who it was. She didn't know why they did it. Was it that they didn't like her presence? Or did they just enjoy it? Arabeth rarely felt like this, thought like this. A good job and a right level of confidence without seeming egotistical. Not wanting to feel this way, think this way, and the sheer unfamiliarity is likely to be the driving force that moved her stuck-in-the-mud feet towards Lupita's front door. Before she knew it, her lock card was out and held against the scanner. Her fingertips were white from the pressure. The agonizing wait between the red light switching to green made her entrance to the room a bit more panicked than she would have hoped. The room was dimly lit as per. When the thick reinforced wooden door clicked behind her in all its deadlock glory, her worries ebbed away as if they were never there. Lupita's room wasn't much. It was good considering the area she lived, but it was mostly down to her nagging and Lupita's own deep-lying need to be mentally occupied. The apartment was compiled of 2 rooms with several different functions. Bathroom, living room minus the life, the toilet, kitchen, study, dining room. And Arabeth knew exactly which out of the 2 she'd be in. Striding through the makeshift living room, with the bed bathtub rusting in the far corner, she clocked one of Lupita's many audio plays of radio transmissions they'd downloaded. She stopped momentarily and randomly fished one out of the collapsed pile. The simple plastic CD case held a scrap piece of paper as their cover. Dr. Smith, distress call 227. Flipping it onto the back, a scrap piece of paper, this time with part of a circular coffee cup stain in the corner, held a small description of what it contained. A 4-minute transcript between a Dr. Smith and Starfleet Knight about an incoming asteroid belt. She didn't know why this sort of thing interested Lupita. At times she'd come in and they'd quickly turn them off as if she was partaking in something illegal. People have become so scared nowadays to show their passions that they've even argued when Arabeth asked her the simplest questions about it. She never held her anger long, though. Certain the high negative feelings had something to do with the Xanitey, and the CDs were a part of how she escaped. Even though scratched and worn, she placed the case down carefully on the cluttered pile before crossing into the next room. The rectangular kitchen/study was the best lit room in the house, this being primarily because of Lupita's solar lamp, powered daily by the punishing suns outside. Her study was a tiny cramped cut-off section that was separated from the kitchen by the change of flooring, tile to brown carpet. That's where she sat. Her dark skin glistened under the lamplight. A layer of moisture sat over any visible part of her skin, a trait she showed through stress and determination. Lupita was working hard on something. Her glasses tried to escape down her nose's profile before being detained by a firm push of Lupita's index finger as her free hand continued to scrawl on the mind sheet. Arabeth picked up the untouched bowl of cold, congealed Otibite from her desk, turning to take it to the dishwasher, when she noticed Lupita's free hand shook more than normal. She placed the bowl down on the kitchen top and crouched so her head was level with hers. "Did they bother you again?" she asked. Lupita stopped in her tracks. The reality wood in her hand accentuated the shake's betraying emotions. Turning her face to Arabeth's, she avoided any eye contact. "Yes," she whispered. "Why did you let them in?" "I guess it could have been because I was worrying about you coming and how dangerous it can be between yours and my place." She turned her head back to the mind sheet. Timidly, she began writing once more, her pace picking up like an old sewing machine, kicking, coughing, spluttering back into life. Arabeth rose to her full height again. Her heart did bleed. The Xanitey attacks were becoming more regular, leaving the one she loved in an awful state. She knew it's why she didn't go outside. In fact, it was screamingly obvious. She didn't need to say it. There were several mind sheets scattered around the small desk Lupita worked on. She eyeballed the one closest to her. The emerald green glow of the letters indicated she had not long finished scribbling on it. She started to read. "I always wondered what it would be like if your different faces met those who came into your life at different points. The stories you've told me and shown me, I almost feel like I was there. If the man called Fitz met the curly-haired behemoth. If Professor Smythe met the one with the young boyish charm, the one with the bow tie, how about if your granddaughter could see you now? Our conversations at the window always have helped me through, and I'm so grateful that you've shared these adventures with me. Thank you, Doctor. Arabeth could have been annoyed that she wrote about this doctor person and their conversations at the window. On a bad day she would have, but she was feeling content and tired. Plus, it wasn't as if she was writing about herself, and not leaving the house means she didn't really have any time to meet or cheat on her. She loves someone else. Using the butt of her palm, she itched her eye and shook off the bad feeling. The dim light was really starting to bother and irritate her eyes. Resuming the task she started, she emptied the thick oaty bite into the bin before crossing to the dishwasher on the far side of the room. Shoving the bowl into the rack of other overwashed, underused cutlery and other appliances, she slammed the hatch door shut. Thinking on her previous complaint, she stared at the window with its closed curtains. The dull glow behind the purple drapes indicated there was still light, and anything was better than the depressing aura she stood in. She took both edges in her grasp and clawed them open, letting the evening light pour in like a dam fit to burst. The yellow giant, with its orange and red moon suns, gave a beautiful sundown with colours you'd see in the desktop backgrounds of the office complex. As it touched her face and every part of her exposed skin, she felt a warmth that forced the corners of her mouth to curl into a smile. She closed her eyes, part because of the intense glare and part because of the blissful feeling of relaxation that shot through her body. When her eyes snapped back open, she looked out over the dry dirt landscape. An unimpressive colour scheme of rusty brown with very little vegetation stretched far into the distance, the only bits of visual diversity being a few withering shrubs and the colossal dunes on the horizon which stole the yellow giant away at night. Two figures stood about 50 metres away. Arabeth narrowed her eyes impatiently as they slowly became more clear to her. Xanitey was one of the figures, standing a good foot taller than the others. The other was the doctor, a woman with blonde bobbed hair, a long flowing grey coat, blue trousers rolled up and ankle-cut boots. Her nose was crinkled currently in what seemed to be a face of abject concentration. They seemed to be having a conversation. Well, the doctor seemed to be talking, and the Xanitey seemed to be just listening. Popping open the window to its full extent, merely a crack, she listened intently to what they were saying. However, it was fruitless. Her voice wasn't nearly loud enough to reach her at this distance. She'd been out there every now and again, and Arabeth only knew her name because Lupita had told her. She'd never been around for one of these conversations the doctor and Lupita had shared, but she'd seen the outsider busying herself about over the last few weeks. The conversation continued as the sun slowly sank like gems in the ocean. "The doctor's out there again," Arabeth said, turning her head back to Lupita. She feigned disinterest, continuing to scribble on the mindsheet as if she hadn't heard her. But every now and again her eyes would flutter to the window to see what was happening and quickly snap back to her work. A few more moments passed, not much changed. The doctor spoke and the Xanitey listened. However, she was now holding a device. Arabeth couldn't see what it was at such a distance, but the way the setting light glinted off its surface, she gathered that it must have been metallic. She had no idea what was going on. A sudden clunking sound forced her heart to skip a beat as her eyes shot down to the dishwasher, which was now shaking violently. She quickly dropped to her knees and jammed her finger at the 3 buttons to shut down the machine. With a quiver, a cough, and a creak, the washer gave in, settling down to a statue level of movement. She stayed still for a moment before breathing a sigh of relief. Lupita desperately needed a new one. Using the kitchen side to help her to her feet, she looked back at the window. It was dark. The light had hidden between the mountains of sand and left the land covered in a blanket of inky blackness. She couldn't see the two figures anymore. She couldn't even see further than 5 feet from the window, the dim light of the kitchen giving little to no visual help at all. "It's finished," came Lupita's voice from beside her. She'd have jumped, if not for the fact it was such a comforting, soothing tone. Arabeth turned to her. In the deafening quiet, Lupita reached over and closed the curtains. Silence had engulfed the apartment, as if a sound that had always been present wasn't there anymore. Probably because she stopped writing, Arabeth thought. Lupita stood in front of her now, a good few inches taller, even when she donned heels. She seemed different. Whereas standing near her was to stand near something sad, it was now a much happier, content feeling that radiated from Lupita's face. Her eyes looked at Arabeth longingly as she hunched over slightly and scooped her up in her arms. The hug raised her feet off the floor. She went to speak, to protest, but instead decided to wrap her arms around Lupita's neck and hug back. Her eyes looked over her desk, where the sole lighting for the room came. The pieces of paper strewn on her comically small desk were empty, and the reality wood snapped in half. Pieces splintered over the table like tree clippings. As they stood in a warm embrace, everything was much better. Everything was right. The feeling of dread had now gone, washed away like footprints on a distant shore. Arabeth was happy. Lupita was happy. Happy.